Ian Fleming was a Cold War spy who honed his craft in World War II, and everything ever written in a James Bond book was based on the exploits of the spy Ian Fleming. Well, that's not really what happened. So the reality is, the first thing, have you ever seen Downton Abbey? And if you're not English, you are not going to be able to comprehend the English class system. You're Australian or American, any other country in the world, possibly if you're Indian with their caste system, you might get what I mean. But really, you have got to be English to understand the rampant class system in the UK. And what I mean by that is, if you watch Downton Abbey, you've got the Earl, who everyone bows and scrapes to because he's God walking earth. And then you've got the various household people. And then you come to the butler, who speaks very proper, and he's a servant. He's a worker, for God's sake. But you would think he was the king of bleeding England. And that's the class system. The butler is the hierarchy. We had a saying when I was in the police force, it probably applies to the army as well, but it was always better to be a sergeant than an inspector, because if you were a sergeant, the highest ranking non-commissioned officers, then you were the king of the ship. Whereas when you got that first commission and you were just a lowly inspector, you then became the shit of the kings. And really that's what it is, because the butler of Downton Abbey was still only the butler. He was still only a worker. He was still only on wages. And yet, how the lower ranks of the staff acted towards the butler as if he was God, and heaven forbid, they would never even be in the same room as the Earl. They would doff their hats and look down at the ground if the Earl walked past. But wait, there's more. Because then the lowly servant, 57 ranks down from the butler, if there was a knock at the door and the front door opened and it was a tradesman, God forbid, at the front door, it would be an absolute outrage. Get round the back. And then when the person went to the back door, they'd have to bow and scrape to the scullery maid. And that is the rampant class system roughly explained in England. So let's start in 1908 when Ian Fleming is born. Is he an impoverished person, learns hard life skills and then becomes a writer? No. When he is born in 1908, he is born into a massively wealthy family, horrendously wealthy parents, whose father comes from a long line of stupendously wealthy individuals. Ian Fleming can wipe his bottom. He can have nappies made of £10 notes. That's how rich he is. So, his dad goes off to war, World War I, gets killed in World War I, was a hero. Ian goes off. As with being wealthy, if you're extremely wealthy in England, there are certain schools you simply must go to, old chum. And then you become an old boy and you're set for life because you went to one of the establishment schools and you're all old chums and mates together. Heaven forbid you try to break into it. And enough said. So of course off he goes to Eton. But he is extremely rich. And so, as well as being surrounded by other extremely rich toffs and snobs, he makes no bones about how rich he is. He buys himself an expensive sports car. He wears flash and fancy clothing that is inappropriate for the establishment. My God, he oils his hair. Oh, the shame. He oils and slicks back his hair, and he has a thing for the ladies. And it doesn't matter if scandal, they're already spoken for, if you get my drift. So he gets kicked out of Eton. Now, when you get kicked out of Eton and your parents have got more money than they know what to do with, they turn around and they say, well, how about we send the chap to Sandhurst? And then he'll get himself a commission and he can be a major in the army and flounce around in some fancy uniform with more money than he knows what to do with. Sadly, he doesn't quite make 1 year at Sandhurst before he gets gonorrhea. Not sure how he got that. Well, moving on, he gets kicked out of Sandhurst. Mummy steps in and says, this is not very good that we are so wealthy and we are so rich and our boy's been kicked out of Eton and he's been kicked out of Sandhurst. Let's send him to a range of ludicrously expensive European small-scale schools where he goes to Munich, we can look it up, variety of other countries where he goes to a couple of different schools, finishing schools, universities, and then when he leaves, he can't get a job. He still can't get a job. So, you know what's coming. Mater, mater, that's what the rich call them. Mater and pater is mum and dad if you're ludicrously rich. So Mater then pulls a few strings with another significantly, a person who was the equal of Rupert Murdoch today, pulls a few strings, and Ian then becomes a journalist flouncing around Europe, drinking champagne, finding married women who want an affair with a young, rich person, and writes stories about various rebellions and uprisings, and writes about Joseph Stalin. And at least he's writing stories as a journalist. But then, did I mention the establishment? Did I mention old boys? Did I mention all these mega wealthy people know each other and hang around with each other? And so a thing happens in Europe, and yes, 1939, World War II starts. So I should mention that when World War II starts in 1939, ever since Ian got kicked out of Sandhurst, his dear old mater, mother, has been trying to get him a job in the Foreign Office. He can be a diplomat in the Foreign Office. He sits the exam, passes allegedly, but with a pass that's so poor, he's not offered a job. From then and through until 39, dear old mum is still trying to get him a job in the Foreign Office, which sounds more prestigious for the family to say Ian is in the Foreign Office than he is a journalist. I hope I'm not going over the top with my expressions here, but the class system in England, you've got to understand it, you've got to know it to believe how bad and rampant it is even to this day. We had a Prime Minister. That Prime Minister once greeted the Queen, she got off the plane, and he put his hand on her back to help guide her. And the stories that exploded around the world. Australian Prime Minister touches the Queen's back. Hung, drawn, and bring back the birch. Hung, drawn and quartered. Chop his head off. He touched the Queen's back. That's a true story. You can go look it up. Forget who the Prime Minister was. He collected clocks. I can remember that. But anyway, moving on. Paul Keating. Anyway, moving on. Sidetracked. Let's not talk about collecting clocks. Haven't got time for that. Moving on. Got to laugh at your own jokes. So, where were we? Had been trying several times to get into the Foreign Office. Couldn't. 1939. World War II is about to start. Things are looking grim. Peace in our time and all that. And so a Rear Admiral in charge of naval intelligence is looking for an admin assistant. A personal assistant that can do admin well. And so Ian Fleming gets a job as the personal assistant of the Rear Admiral in charge of naval intelligence. When he gets that job, If you saw my video about Albert R. Broccoli and Howard Hughes, then here we go again. What a coincidence with this James Bond thing. That here's Ian Fleming. Yes, it's a bit different here that Ian Fleming is ludicrously wealthy, but he clicks with the Rear Admiral in charge of Naval Intelligence. They get on really well, and not only that, it is seen that Ian has a flair for writing and for administration. Some of the things that Fleming wrote later on, too detailed to go into in this video, but when he wrote plans for possible events to happen, his flamboyant use of words in his reports, where he writes the report about putting documents on a dead body and throwing it into the sea so the Germans think the invasion's going to happen at Calais. He writes in that plan, but it had better be a fresh body. He puts these flamboyant little words in, calls the enemy Red Indians, things like that. And so he does become entrenched in the Rear Admiral's staff, and he gets to go to all these meetings with various plans are being drawn up for the D-Day, invasion of Italy. He's in there in the thick of it. He has his own code name 007, and he pinched that? No. Was his code name something flamboyant? Let's be real. This isn't movies and TV. His code name, all through World War II, whenever Ian Fleming was referred to, he was referred to as 17 Foxtrot. That's who Ian Fleming was, 17 Foxtrot. He operated out of room 39 at the Admiralty. The Admiralty was the hub of all things military in World War II. Winston Churchill was there all the time. Winston Churchill met and talked and dealt with Ian Fleming on a regular basis. Wrote his obituary, you might have done. Okay, moving on. So that's how Ian Fleming got involved. So then the Americans enter the war, and he's involved very heavily with the people that are setting up the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. He's involved with them and their operations. He goes to America, he goes to the Far East. He's involved in all of these things. He's not a hands-on spy himself. He never ever goes behind the lines himself. He is never in harm's way himself, apart from the very fact that he could have been killed in a London air raid, but he's never on the front line at all, ever. But he does mix in all these circles, even to the point that when the Americans are thinking of setting up the CIA, they're thinking of setting up the Central Intelligence Agency, Ian Fleming is involved in that. It is quite incredible. And it's all through chance and family connections, and not through having any skill or working his way up through naval intelligence or being a spy or anything like that. An admin officer in the right place at the right time that's then involved in everything Candlestein that happens in World War II. When World War II is over, it's all over for Ian Fleming. His boss is retired, and nobody wants him because basically he's an anachronism. He's an unqualified leftover from World War II. So he gets this wild idea that he's going to write a book. One of his operations when he was in World War II was called Operation Goldeneye. So he sits down to write a book about James Bond. He says he invented the name James Bond because he wanted his James Bond to be the blandest, most forgettable, inconspicuous man possible. And he'd once met an author, a bird watcher, a person who'd written a book about birds. His name was James Bond. He considered him the most boring person he'd ever met in his life. And that's how he came up with the name James Bond. And so when a few people read his first draft of his first book, they all say, it is dreadful, it is predictable, it has no plot line. He gets some shocking reviews by some people when he does this first book. But despite what these people say about these drafts being dreadful, he actually, in all, he wrote 12 James Bond books, and then he wrote 2 books of James Bond short stories. But the one I was telling you about, GoldenEye, that's not the one he sent off to a publisher. He then wrote Casino Royale. And when he wrote that, again, this is all through connections and who you know. Do you know how hard it is to get a book published? You know, Stephen King got something like 63 rejections before somebody finally said, oh, I think this bloke can write. And the other one, the lawyer from the Deep South that wrote all those lawyer books about the jury and all of that, he was the same. He'll tell you how many rejections he got. Well, good old Ian Fleming, he never got any rejections. Well, of course he didn't, because Mater and Pater had more money than the Bank of England. And so, of course, his first book, Casino Royale, got released in 1952, not 1953, as much of what the internet will tell you, but Casino Royale, released in 1952, and when it was released, it was a smash success that immediately called for an immediate second reprint that completely sold out and called for a completely separate reprint number 3 straight away. And then what we get to from that date, 52, we then get Harry Saltzman picking up a James Bond book, reading it, going, oh my God, the potential here. Going to see Ian Fleming saying, yep, I'll sell you the rights to everything. And then Albert R. Broccoli coming along and saying, woo, I've got to get on this bandwagon. Harry saying, no way, am I going to share my royalties with you? And then going into partnership, and that's all covered in another video. And there you go, that's the story of how James Bond came into being. The last little tidbit I'll leave you with, because this might not make it a whole video, so the last little tidbit is Harry Saltzman had the rights, and he could do anything he wanted with that book rights. Broccoli came along and said, hang on mate, you've had these rights for a while, you've done nothing with it because you can't get financing, I know what I'm doing. I've been making movies in Hollywood for yonks. I'll get these movies. Harry says yes. Albert says okay. They do a deal. And then when they go to interview a bloke, they audition. Who on earth are we going to get to play James Bond? They hear about this 2-bit, half unemployed, no good actor, rough as guts, Scottish bloke. They hear about him. So they invite him to have a meal with them. I shouldn't say too much, perhaps I will make a video about this, but the thing about that is that Ian Fleming was there. Ian Fleming, if you ever look at photos, it's no wonder, I say, old chap, it's no wonder he got kicked out of Eton, because cigarette, long, sorry old man, I do apologise old chap, he had a long cigarette holder and slick back hair. And he's like, do you know I've got £250,000 hidden in my underpants? There's so much money. And so Ian Fleming met this Scottish git, come in to be auditioned for James Bond, and Ian Fleming was appalled. Hey, we cannot have a person like this playing a British secret agent. Oh my God, no. And so that was what Ian Fleming, multi-millionaire that he was, thought of the original selection of James Bond. And of course, it's the fact of it is that Harry and his wife and Albert and his wife were having a meal with Sean Connery, and Sean Connery put on an act like he couldn't give a shit, didn't care, abrasive, cheeky, talk back, rude, because that's my way, that's how I am, don't like it, fuck off. And when he walked out of the room, they say he walked off, they watched him leave, he walked out with a swagger, and they said, that is James Bond. Probably don't have to make that video now. Alrighty, that's it. Exit stage left? No, we're not, you're not. You're supposed to exit stage right. Till next time, cheers.